Hi. So, yeah, the topic du jour is gratitude, which is actually a theme I explored in a previous video about a year ago. But I'd like to revisit that topic in this video, partly because it's been a pretty big part of my own spiritual development these days, and partly because I sense that it's very relevant to a lot of the struggle and division occurring in our world. So basically, I want to explore how gratitude enhances our lives, at a personal level, at the interpersonal level, and also at the social and cultural levels. Anyhow, here's the usual table of contents for the material in this video. As usual, you can find the same table of contents in the description section of this video, along with links to the timestamps. So, let's begin by getting a handle on what we mean by gratitude. The dictionary defines it in terms of appreciating and giving thanks for what we have, and also in terms of a readiness to return kindness. However, at this point we should probably also note that gratitude is not merely a specific phenomenon we sometimes experience. More importantly, it can also denote a much more general way of moving through life. Basically, an attitude of gratitude, which is a phrase that comes to us from 12-step addiction recovery programs. And at first, that might seem like the simplest thing in the world. But in practice, it usually turns out to be quite a bit trickier than that. But why? Well, in my own experience, it's mainly because a lot of us find it much easier to focus and fixate on the negative, on what's broken or missing or inadequate. Basically, a lot of us find it much easier to see the glass of life as half empty rather than half full, which of course makes feeling gratitude a relatively elusive thing in our lives. And if you don't believe me, well, think about how a lot of us view our bodies. I'd hazard that most of us see ourselves as a little too fat, or a little too short, or a little too bald, or our nose is too damn big. I think you get the picture. But the fact is that for most of us, our bodies are working just fine overall. Our legs are letting us walk around, our brains are letting us understand things pretty well, our senses are letting us experience different things in the world. But instead of feeling gratitude for all of that, we tend to fixate on one or two comparatively trivial things like how big our nose is. And then worry about it and fret and ruminate over it ad nauseum. And then maybe consider getting surgery for it, etc., etc. Hell, it's like we're all suffering from a big collective case of body dysmorphic disorder, as psychologists call it, and are consequently letting our big schnozzes, now taken as a metaphor for our physical imperfections in general, we're letting them take over our lives. Especially when you consider the fact that practically no one in this world has a perfect body. A body without flaws or imperfections of any kind. And for those that would seem to, well, just take a look at them after 30 or 40 years of wear and tear. But the main point here has to do with how we tend to fixate on what seems imperfect or inadequate, not just in the physical sphere, but in many other areas of life too. And in the process, we tend to neglect the many, many parts of our lives that are working just fine, which in turn makes feeling gratitude difficult, especially since the parts of our lives that are working fine tend not to appear within our perceptual fields in the first place. And it's very hard to be thankful for something when we aren't even close to perceiving it. Consequently, the first challenge of gratitude has to do with cultivating the kind of mindful awareness that would allow us to perceive what we have to be grateful for. Basically, the boons and benefits we tend to take for granted. In other words, cultivating our capacity for gratitude means expanding our consciousness and our awareness of the reality we're actually inhabiting, especially so we can perceive all of the wonderful gifts we're already receiving, all of the ways that our lives are going right. And here, as so often happens in my videos, I'd like to recommend meditation as a practical way of cultivating that kind of awareness. But of course, meditation is obviously not everyone's cup of tea. But that's not the point. The point is to find some way of deepening our consciousness of reality, because without doing that, gratitude will always be an elusive thing for us. And the whole attitude of gratitude posture toward life will be pretty much unattainable. However, the second thing that makes gratitude a challenge is the fact that, contrary to popular opinion, most of us are secretly in love with our suffering and are positively addicted to it. So much so that we'll actively go out of our way to perpetuate it and generate even more of it in our lives. Of course, that's definitely not what we typically tell ourselves. What we typically tell ourselves is that we're being oppressed and victimized, and that it's just not fair. And along the way, we usually try to shift blame for our problems onto other people, or perhaps onto systemic conditions in our world more generally. But the truth is that none of that helps us move past our suffering. It doesn't make us any stronger or better, and it doesn't improve our overall lot in life. Instead, it just keeps us mired in our already existing misery and pathology. So, I say that we're in love with our suffering because usually we end up doing the exact thing that prolongs and perpetuates it the most. And at the same time, the last thing we want to do is to assume direct personal responsibility for the quality of our lives, which is the only thing that actually helps us. But the main point here is that when we've thoroughly convinced ourselves that our personal difficulties in life are really someone else's fault and someone else's responsibility, when we're thoroughly mired in the whole somebody owes me mentality, well, it makes it really hard to perceive the positive parts of life and to feel gratitude for them. And because of all of that, if I had to name the exact opposite of an attitude of gratitude, it would probably be something like an attitude of entitlement. Mostly because entitlement is about being resentful about what we don't have, whereas gratitude is about being happy with what we do have, which of course is a completely different way of relating to life. But not only that. When we're filled with a lot of entitled resentment and ingratitude toward life, it naturally toxifies our relationships with the people around us, and with the world more generally, too. As the old adage goes, we reap what we sow. And in the case of an attitude of entitlement, well, the truth is that hardly anyone respects that or wants to be around it. That's because practically no one wants to be subjected to a lot of rancorous complaining and judgmental finger-pointing. Basically, as the comedian Bill Burr puts it, almost no one wants to hear about how my shit sandwich is worse than your shit sandwich. And the reason is that we pretty much all realize that every human life knows its share of pain, misery, and injustice, and that we're all born to a tragic lot in this life. Or, to put it in the concise words of Buddhism's First Noble Truth, life is suffering. And sure, some of us certainly seem to have more of that than others of us do. But as John F. Kennedy once famously put it, there is always inequality in life. Life is unfair. Surprise! Of course, all of that doesn't stop us from indulging in the childish fantasy that the world should pay attention to all of our rancorous complaining and belly aching. But the obvious problem is that that's not how the world works, at least not usually. But once again, the main point is that embodying an attitude of entitlement toward life doesn't do much to improve our social relationships, and it doesn't do much to improve our world more generally. But on the other hand, I'd say that adopting an attitude of gratitude and thankfulness tends to produce the exact opposite effects. It enhances and deepens our connection with the people around us. It builds bridges between us rather than more chasms and divides, and it consequently improves our world more generally. That's first because when we're able to engage the world in a grateful way, it's also easy to feel gratitude for the people around us and to appreciate them for who and what they are, even if their thinking and values are very different from our own. Or perhaps precisely because of those differences. As a consequence, it's easy to see them as our friends and as our companions in the great journey of life, rather than as enemies. And instead of peevishly insisting that the people around us need to fall in line with our own values and projects, we can let them be what they are and feel thankful for the fact that they're already enhancing our lives by dint of their very presence in this universe. And I suspect that that's why the idea of adopting an attitude of gratitude figures so prominently in 12-step recovery programs. It's because when we learn to feel fundamentally good about life, well, at that point, we're probably going to feel a lot less need to narcotize ourselves with drugs and alcohol. Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? But like I suggested earlier, all of that would require expanding our consciousness and our capacity for mindful awareness, and also giving up our attachment to being miserable, which is not necessarily an easy sacrifice. But I'd also say that developing our capacity for experiencing gratitude involves deepening our ability to perceive beauty in the world. Beauty in other people, beauty in ourselves, and beauty in the universe more generally. But the thing about experiencing beauty is that it requires being open to noticing it in the first place. And once again, that's not necessarily an easy thing, especially since being open also entails a certain degree of vulnerability. And of course, when we're vulnerable, we can also easily be hurt. It's a little bit like falling in love with someone. Basically, the more deeply we fall in love, the more deeply we can be hurt. The higher we fly, the farther we can fall. And that same logic applies to falling in love with life itself. The more open we are to loving life, the more we can be battered and bruised by it. So if our fundamental project in this world is to remain as safe as possible, well, it doesn't make much sense to open ourselves to the greater charm and beauty of life, or to feel gratitude as a consequence. The safest posture is always to remain as distantly cynical and judgmental as possible, to ascribe to the idea that life must be a lousy, rotten misadventure. That's far safer than experiencing beauty and gratitude, because when we think about life in a cynical, resentful way, then whatever pain we feel will only be what we've been anticipating all along. Only a confirmation of our already existing expectations. And okay, it's perfectly understandable that we'd want to safeguard ourselves by employing strategies of those kinds. But when you think about it, is that really what life is all about? You know, always trying to stay safe as possible, never taking a chance on anything or anyone, never daring to feel all that we can feel in this world? Well, I guess it's a pretty personal question, but my own answer is that there's actually a time and a place to live dangerously, a time to take chances with life, to think the outrageous, possibly inappropriate thought, and to experience life with a real sense of adventure. And the thing about adventure is that it's not really adventure until something's at stake, until there's something to lose as well as something to gain. Of course, there's always a difference between downright stupidity and adventure, which is a distinction that's not always as clear-cut as it might seem at first. But the main point I'm trying to make is that feeling gratitude is actually an act of bravery, especially because of the openness and vulnerability it requires. Gratitude is a courageous choice that requires cultivating a certain relation to danger as well as to the myriad fears that end up governing large portions of our lives. And that's another reason why experiencing gratitude is somewhat challenging. It's because there are always around 10,000 good, convincing, safe reasons not to feel grateful. and really only one or two good reasons to feel that way. Consequently, at a very personal level, gratitude is about a choice. A courageous choice between love and fear, and which one of those we're going to let be the main governing principle of our lives. Okay, so let's move toward ending this video by posing one final overarching question. How can we ever hope to affect positive change in our world merely by practicing gratitude? After all, doesn't the world change mostly because of our efforts to force it to become something else, and not through our appreciation for what it already is? And here, I guess I'd like to draw on the wisdom of the great humanistic psychologist Carl Rogers, who opines that it's only when we thoroughly accept what we are and begin to treat each other with what he calls unconditional positive regard that things begin to change. And that's the paradox of it, that the world changes mostly when we accept and love it as it is, not when we're trying to force it to be what we want it to be. But perhaps I can make that somewhat counterintuitive idea a little more accessible by bringing it down to the personal level. When you think about it, how often do you change when someone's trying to force you to be something that you're not? I bet it's not too often. I bet that when that sort of thing happens, you mostly dig in your heels and resist change as much as you can. But on the other hand, when you do change, doesn't it happen mostly when someone really sees you for who and what you are and accepts and appreciates you on that basis? Don't you change mostly when someone implicitly invites you to change and not when he's trying to coerce you somehow? Isn't that the thing that really helps you become a better person, a better human being? And so the question is, why should we expect it to be any different for the world? Similarly, in Zen Mind Beginner's Mind, Shunryu Suzuki talks about the best way to control an angry, agitated cow, which of course is a metaphor not only for our own minds, but for the world more generally. Anyhow, according to Suzuki, the best way is not to try to impose our will on that metaphorical cow by confining it to a tiny restrictive stall, because doing that will only agitate it even more. Instead, the best way is to give it the widest, most fertile pasture possible so that it can roam at will. And gratitude is a lot like that wide pasture. In other words, the first and best way to help our world change is, somewhat paradoxically, to let it be what it is, to let it find its own organic path toward transcendence, rather than to try to twist and cram it onto the Procrustean bed of our desires. Doesn't really matter how well intended they may be. That's because in the final analysis, things like friendship, love, and gratitude are actually the most potent forces for positive change in our world. And all of our self-righteous resentment, outrage, and entitlement, well, all of that only keeps our world continually mired in its age-old problems and pathologies. Basically, at the end of the day, love wins. Surprise! Oh, but hell, don't take my word for it. Go out into the world and see for yourself. Anyhow, thanks as always for watching and listening. I feel gratitude for your presence and for your willingness to hear what I'm saying. And so yes, many thanks for all of that. And of course, as always, take care of your soul.